Welcome back to the deep dive. I am genuinely excited for this one because we are tackling a subject that on the surface feels like, it feels like the most obvious topic in the world.
Right. It really does.
We're talking about a name that has essentially just become a synonym for goodness.
Oh, absolutely. It is one of those names that has just transcended history and become a sort of cultural shorthand. You drop this name in a conversation and everyone knows exactly what you mean. It's the gold standard of altruism.
Exactly. We're talking about Mother Teresa. And here's the big but. That really got me hooked on our source material today. I realized that while I know the icon,
the meme almost.
Yeah, the meme, the image of the tiny woman in the white sari. I realized I didn't actually know this story.
And that is a very common blind spot for a lot of people. We are kind of blinded by the light of the legacy.
Yeah.
You know, we know the Nobel Peace Prize, we know the sainthood, the global applause, but the actual trajectory, the specific grinded out steps that took a young girl from the Balkans and placed her in the slums of Calcutta, that is so often lost in the mythology.
And it is exactly what I want to do with you listening today. We want to unpack the specific trajectory of her life based on the biographical accounts we have. Because when you look at the source material, this isn't just a story about prayer.
Not at all.
It's a story about logistics. It's a story about management and radical transitions. The sheer administrative grit involved is mind-blowing.
Absolutely. And to frame this properly, we are looking at a life that spans almost the entire 20th century.
From 1910 to 1997.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to understand the evolution of her work. We're going to trace the steps from her early years to her time as a teacher, then a founder, and finally a saint. Because you have to ask, how do you go from one woman with zero budget to a global organization operating in 123 countries?
That scale is it's what blows my mind. 123 countries.
It's massive.
That is multinational corporation level of reach.
It is. And it didn't happen by accident. It happened through a very specific sequence of choices.
So let's rewind the clock all the way back to the origins. And I think the first surprise for you listening, and it was for me too, is the geography.
Yeah.
Because we are not starting in India. We aren't even close to India.
No, we are in the Balkans. Specifically, we are in a place called Skopje,
which is the current capital of the Republic of Macedonia.
Correct. But the year is 1910, August 26th, 1910. And the world is on the brink of massive change. World War I is right around the corner, and a baby girl is born.
And her name is not Teresa.
No. Her birth name is Agnes. Agnes Bangsa Bajaksiu.
I have been practicing that pronunciation all morning. Bajaksiu.
You're getting there. It's an Albanian name. Her parents were Nicola and Dranophile Bajaksiu. And looking at the family dynamic here gives us our first critical clue about who she would become.
Because this wasn't a family of destitute poverty, right?
Quite the opposite, actually. Her father, Nicola, was an Albanian businessman. He was a contractor, a supplier. But more than that, he was a benefactor and a politician.
Wow.
He was deeply involved in the community. He had real status.
And her mother, Dranophile, was a grocer. So you have a household that is fundamentally rooted in trade, in commerce, and the exchange of goods.
Yes.
So Agnes grew up understanding how the world worked. It sounds like a relatively stable, perhaps even comfortable early childhood.
It was for those first few years. She was living in a home that clearly valued education and community standing. But then we hit the first major turning point in Agnes's life. When she was only 8 years old, tragedy struck.
Her father died.
Yes. Nicola died when Agnes was just 8. And we really have to pause and think about the impact of that. Losing a parent is traumatic at any age, but at 8.
Yeah, that marks the end of the initial family structure she knew. It completely shifts the dynamic, the protector figure, the businessman, the politician. He's just gone.
And it leaves the family in a much more precarious position, though they did manage to keep going. It likely drew Agnes much closer to her mother. It introduces a certain resilience into her character very early on.
And yet, looking at the notes on her teenage years, it doesn't seem like she retreated into a shell. She didn't just lock herself away.
No, she was very much out in the world. She attended a convent-run primary school, which you might expect, but then she switched to a state-run secondary school.
That detail really stood out to me, a state-run school. That means she was sitting in classrooms with kids from different backgrounds, different faiths, different social strata. She wasn't cloistered.
Exactly. She was part of the civic fabric of Skopje. And she had hobbies, too. The sources mentioned she sang.
Right in the choir.
She was actually a soloist in the local Sacred Heart Choir.
I love that image. Just imagine the future Mother Teresa as a teenager, worrying about choir practice, doing homework for her state school, helping her mom. It grounds her. It makes her seem like a real person, not just a statue.
It really humanizes her. She was just a girl named Agnes who went to school and liked to sing. But then we get to 1928. Agnes is 18 years old.
The age of decision.
The age where everything changes. She decides to become a nun. But she doesn't just join a local order in Skopje. She sets off for Ireland.
Ireland. From Macedonia to Ireland in 1928. That is not a small trip.
Not at all. That's a massive cultural leap.
It's a huge dislocation. She left her family, her language, and her culture to join the Sisters of Loreto in Dublin. And she did it because the Sisters of Loreto were known for their mission work in India.
So Ireland was just the staging ground.
Exactly. She goes to Dublin to learn English and get her initial training. And it's here that the name Agnes effectively disappears from the record. She takes a new name.
Sister Mary Teresa.
Sister Mary Teresa.
And I really want to emphasize the sister part there. We are not at mother yet.
Not at all. She is a novice. She is at the very bottom of the hierarchy.
So she spends a few months in Ireland, and then in 1929, she gets on a boat again. And she finally heads to the destination we all associate with her, India.
She arrives in India in 1929, and this is where the biggest misconception in her biography usually pops up.
Right. I think most people, including me, imagine her getting off the boat in Calcutta, seeing a person dying on the street, and immediately starting her work in the slums. That is the movie version for sure. But the reality is quite different. When she arrives in 1929, she initiates her novitiate in Darjeeling, West Bengal.
Now, Darjeeling is in the foothills of the Himalayas, right? It's stunningly beautiful. It's tea country. It's very different from the urban chaos of Calcutta.
Very different. It's cooler. It's quieter. And she is there to complete her training. She initiates her novitiate and she becomes a teacher.
A teacher.
Yes. She is assigned to St. Teresa's school, and she follows the very structured traditional path of a nun. She takes her first religious vows in May 1931.
Okay, so that's the first step of formal commitment.
And then the final profession of vows happens a few years later on May 24th, 1937.
And that is when the name shifts again.
Yes. With those final vows in 1937, she acquired the name the world recognizes, Mother Teresa.
But we have to be careful with the context here, right?
Very careful. Mother in this setting wasn't some global title of honor. It was a title used for a fully professed nun, often one with authority within a school or convent.
It was a job title, essentially.
Yeah. In a way, yes. Because for the next 20 years, she's dedicated entirely to education.
I think we need to dwell on that duration. 20 years, that is a whole career.
It is a lifetime in the workforce.
Yeah.
From 1929 until the late 1940s, she is in the school system. She taught at St. Mary's School. And she wasn't just a background figure. She eventually graduated to the post of principal in 1944.
A principal. Principal Teresa.
Think about the skill set required to be a principal.
Right.
You are managing staff. You are managing hundreds of students. You are dealing with administration schedules, discipline budgets, parents.
You are putting out fires every single day.
Exactly. And I think this is a crucial insight that the source material really highlights. When she eventually started her own order, she wasn't just operating on pure spiritual impulse.
No.
She had decades of administrative experience. She knew how to run an institution. She had been a boss.
That creates such a fascinating before and after. You have the principal, comfortable, relatively speaking, within the walls of the school and the convent. She has a career, she has respect, and then something happens.
The call within a call.
September 10th, 1946.
That is the pivotal date. The source describes it as the day that would transform her life completely.
So she's a principal. It's 1946. The war has just ended.
Yeah.
India is going through massive changes with independence and partition, and she feels this sudden shift.
She described it as a command, a directive to leave the convent and help the poor while living among them.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me and where we see her incredible discipline. She doesn't just run out the door the next day.
No, she doesn't. And this is where that principal mindset kicks in. She knows how organizations work. She knows she can't just go rogue.
So she waits.
She waits. This is a story of process over impulse. She received the call in September 1946, but she didn't receive the final approval to pursue this new calling until January 1948.
That is almost a year and a half.
Yes. She had to get permission from the local Archbishop, Ferdinand Perrier. She had to wait for the church hierarchy to review her request to be excloistered.
Excloistered meaning living outside the convent while remaining a nun.
Exactly.
That is a long time to sit with a burning desire to change your life. It really highlights the bureaucratic nature of the church, but also her incredible patience. She didn't break the rules. She waited until she could change the rules for herself.
And when she finally got that green light in January 1948, the transformation was visual as well as spiritual.
This is the real branding moment.
August 17th, 1948. She begins her missionary work with the poor, and she makes a very deliberate choice. She replaces the traditional Laredo habit.
Which looked like what exactly?
It was heavy, black, voluminous, and very European. Not exactly suited for the intense heat of the slums and very much a symbol of the institution.
So she swaps it for
a simple white cotton sari with a blue border.
the look that is now iconic. But at the time, it was a radical move.
It was the dress of the poor Indian woman. It was a clear statement of solidarity. She was saying, I am not above you. I am one of you. It completely broke down the visual barrier between the helper and the helped.
And so dressed in that sari, she heads out. December 21st, 1948, her first official outing into the slums.
And the mission was simple, to help the people directly in the slums. No walls, no school desk, no principal's office, just the streets.
It's incredible to think about that transition. Walking away from the principalship to walk into the slums. But she didn't stay alone for long. She was a builder at heart.
No, she was never going to be a solo operator. And this brings us to the next phase, the building of the Missionaries of Charity.
Right, so she starts alone in 1948. When does it become an official organization?
October 7th, 1950. That is when she received Vatican permission to start the congregation known as the Missionaries of Charity.
And how big was this global empire at the very start?
13 members.
Just 13.
13 sisters. That's it. You have to contrast that humble beginning with the massive global figures we will discuss later. It started incredibly tiny.
But they got to work fast. And what's interesting from the sources is they didn't just do general charity, they specialize.
This is the part of the research that really impressed me. She diversified the care. She didn't just say we help the poor. She identified specific needs and built specific institutions for them. She essentially created verticals of care.
Right. The source mentions the Home for the Dying.
Yes, inaugurated in 1952. It was called Normal Friday. This was for people who were literally dying on the streets, rejected by local hospitals. She created a place where they could simply die with dignity.
And then she tackled Hansen's disease.
Leprosy. In the 1950s, the stigma around leprosy was horrific. These people were complete outcasts. She initiated a home called Shantinagar, which means Town of Peace, specifically for those suffering from Hansen's disease.
And orphans, too.
Yes, in 1955, she opened Nirmala Shishu Bhavan. That translates to the Children's Home of the Immaculate Heart. This was dedicated to orphans and homeless youths.
So within just 5 years, from 1950 to 1955, she has established the order, a home for lepers, and a home for orphans.
She was systematizing care for different types of destitution. She saw a specific problem and built a specific solution. And because she had these clear models, she could replicate them.
And replicate them she did. The growth was incredibly rapid.
By 1960, the Missionaries of Charity had opened hospices, orphanages, and leper houses all over India.
All over India. So in one decade, she essentially covered the subcontinent in a charitable sense.
And she wasn't stopping with just the sisters. In 1963, the Missionaries of Charity Brothers was founded.
So expanding the workforce to include men.
Exactly, widening the net. Because there was intense physical work to be done in places where men could go that the sisters perhaps couldn't.
So we have reached the 1960s. She is a household name in India. The order is fully established. But this is the point where the story goes from local hero to a true global phenomenon.
Right, going global.
So where was the first house outside of India? I feel like this is a great trivia question.
It really is. Most people would guess Rome or maybe London, but it was actually Venezuela.
Venezuela, I definitely wouldn't have guessed that.
1965. She opened a house there with 5 sisters. That was the breach in the dam. Once they figured out how to operate internationally, the floodgates opened.
So after Venezuela, where did they go?
It was Rome, then Tanzania, then Austria. By the 1970s, the order had reached Asia, Africa, Europe, and the United States.
It's spreading like a franchise. And she kept adding layers to the organization, right? It wasn't just about geographical expansion, it was structural expansion too.
Yes, it was. In 1976, she opened a contemplative branch of the sisters. These were nuns dedicated more to prayer than the active street work. Then, in 1981, she began the Corpus Christi movement for priests.
And the Missionaries of Charity Fathers followed in 1984.
Plus, she brought in lay people. The source lists the co-workers of Mother Teresa, the sick and suffering co-workers, and the lay missionaries of charity.
She really was building a deeply layered organization. She found a way for everyone from a priest to a sick layperson to be part of her mission.
It's brilliant organizational design. You don't just rely on one type of worker. You create tiers of participation to maximize your human resources.
Now, amidst all this organizational talk, there's one specific anecdote in the source material that really jumped out at me. Because usually we picture her washing feet or holding hands in a hospice. But there was a moment in 1982 that feels almost like an action movie.
Oh, you're talking about the Beirut rescue.
Yes, tell us about that because it's wild.
It was 1982, the siege of Beirut. It was a full-blown war zone. Israel and the PLO were fighting apart. The city was being shelled constantly. And there was a frontline hospital that had been completely cut off.
And who was inside?
37 children. Children with severe mental and physical disabilities. They were trapped.
And Mother Teresa just shows up.
She shows up. She somehow manages to negotiate a temporary ceasefire, which is incredible in itself, and she goes in. She rescued almost 37 children who are trapped there.
She literally went into a war zone.
She went where the need was, even if that meant crossing a front line. It really breaks the pattern of just opening homes. It shows a physical courage and a willingness to step into immediate danger.
That is intense. It really changes the perception of her as just a passive figure. She was a serious operator.
Absolutely.
And then a couple of years later, she is in the South Bronx.
1984. The first Missionaries of Charity home in the United States was established in the South Bronx, New York.
Talk about range. Beirut to the Bronx.
She recognized that poverty wasn't just an Indian problem. The West had its own kind of poverty. Drugs, loneliness, violence. She wanted to be there too.
And then perhaps the most emotional journey of all. In 1991, she finally returned to her homeland.
Back to Albania.
She hadn't been back since 1937.
Right. Correct. More than 50 years. The communist regime in Albania had been incredibly harsh on religion for decades. But when the Iron Curtain finally fell, she returned. She opened a Missionaries of Charity Brothers home right in Tirana.
That must have been quite a moment. Leaving as an 18-year-old girl named Agnes, disappearing into the world, and returning as the world-famous Mother Teresa to open a home in your own country.
It's a true full-circle moment, the closure of that long arc.
And by this time, the world had definitely noticed her work.
We need to talk about the trophy cabinet, because the list of awards she received is just staggering.
It is a mix of everything. Secular, religious, Indian, international.
Let's run through the timeline of that recognition.
It really starts picking up in the 60s. In 1962, she received the Ramon Magsaysay Award for International Understanding. That's often called the Asian Nobel. The citation was specifically for her merciful cognizance of the abject poor.
Merciful cognizance. That is a really beautiful phrase.
That same year, 1962, the Indian government awarded her the Padma Shri.
And then the Vatican chimes in. 1971, she was awarded the first Pope John XXIII Peace Prize.
But the big one, the one that puts you in the history books forever, came in 1979.
The Nobel Peace Prize.
That's the peak of global recognition. But she also received India's highest civilian award, right?
Yes, the Bharat Ratna and the Jawaharlal Nehru Award for International Understanding. She was recognized by the state of India just as much as she was by the church or the West.
And while she is collecting all these awards, the organization is just exploding in size.
By 1997, which is the year of her death, the numbers are unbelievable. Remember, she started with 13 members.
Right back in 1950.
By 1997, there were almost 4,000 sisters.
4,000.
Working in 610 foundations across 450 centers.
And the geographic reach.
123 countries across 6 continents.
From 13 sisters in Calcutta to 4,000 sisters in 123 countries. That is the definition of scaling up.
It's a massive global footprint, a tangible legacy of bricks and mortar.
But as with all human stories, time eventually catches up.
It does. We see the physical decline start in the 80s. She suffered a heart attack while visiting Pope John Paul II in Rome in 1983.
That's a serious warning sign.
But she kept going for another 14 years. She had a pacemaker, she had multiple health scares, but she didn't stop working. Until September 5th, 1997.
She died in Calcutta.
Yes,
Yeah.
at the age of 87. Calcutta, West Bengal, India. The place she had made her home since 1929.
But unlike most people, her story doesn't end with her death. In fact, a whole new chapter slut. The path to sainthood.
And this was a very fast path. Usually the Catholic Church moves in centuries. With Mother Teresa, they moved in years.
When was she beatified?
2003, just 6 years after her death. Pope John Paul II beatified her at St. Peter's Basilica. She became Blessed Mother Teresa.
And then the final step.
Canonization. September 4th, 2016. Pope Francis declared her a saint.
St. Teresa of Calcutta.
That is her official title now. Saint Teresa of Calcutta.
It's really amazing. From Agnes and Scapci to St. Teresa in the Vatican books forever.
It really is a remarkable journey.
You know, there is a quote in the source material that I think sums up her philosophy perfectly. It really explains how she did all this.
Which one is that?
She said, "Yesterday is gone, tomorrow has not yet come. We have only today, let us begin."
Let us begin. I love the immediacy of that. It's not about grand 5-year plans. It's about doing the work that is right in front of you today.
Exactly. It's entirely action-oriented. Don't worry about yesterday. Don't stress about tomorrow. Just start now.
And that's exactly how you build a global mission, one day at a time, one person at a time.
So we have traced the arc from the grocer's daughter to the Nobel laureate, from the teacher to the saint. But before we go, I want to leave you listening with a thought to chew on.
What's that?
I just can't stop thinking about that call within a call. The idea that you can be highly successful in one path like she was as a principal, doing genuinely good work, and yet you can decide to start over completely at the bottom for a new purpose.
It's a very powerful challenge. Are we willing to leave our own principalship to find our real work?
That is the question. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.
A pleasure as always.
And to you listening, whatever your today looks like, let us begin. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're opening up a dossier that honestly feels less like a standard biography and more like a blueprint for a political earthquake.
That is a very vivid image, but honestly, it's not far off the mark.
Right.
We are talking about a leader who completely defined a decade, someone who reshaped the geopolitical landscape, and probably caused more shouting matches at dinner tables than any other British figure in the 20th century.
Yet we are talking, of course, about Margaret Thatcher.
The Iron Lady.
Exactly, the Iron Lady, the first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And before we get into the timeline today, which frankly is a pretty wild ride from a grocery store all the way to the House of Lords, I want to start right off the bat with a quote from our source material.
Oh, I think I know the one you're going for.
I bet you do. I feel like this quote is it's the master key to unlocking her entire psychology. It goes like this, quote, "I love argument. I love debate. I don't expect anyone just to sit there and agree with me. That's not their job," unquote.
It's such a striking statement, isn't it?
It really is. If you just pause and think about the modern political landscape for a second, today, everything feels so carefully curated.
Highly focus grouped.
Right. Politicians are terrified of being disliked. They want consensus. They want to be the person you'd, want to have a beer with. And here she is effectively saying, no, please fight me on this. I want the conflict.
Exactly. It completely reframes how we view leadership because she wasn't a consensus builder. She was a conviction politician.
Right.
She didn't view an argument as a sign that things were going wrong. She viewed it as the necessary friction to get to the truth, or well, at least her truth.
Her truth, yeah.
She wasn't looking for friends. She was looking for a result.
I don't expect anyone just to sit there and agree with me. It's almost aggressive.
It is aggressive. It's an outright challenge. And what we're going to do today is unpack the life of the woman behind that quote. Because when you look at her background, as it's laid out in the biographical transcript we're using today,
it's a really unlikely journey.
Completely unlikely.
Yeah, if you were writing a screenplay for a generic prime minister, you just wouldn't write this script. Our sources trace her life from living above a grocery store in Grantham through the chemistry labs of Oxford, which, by the way, we definitely need to talk about, all the way to the highest office in the land.
It's a trajectory that covers 3 very distinct disciplines. You have the scientist, the lawyer, and the politician.
The triple threat.
Exactly, the triple threat. And I think that's the lens we have to use today for our listeners. If you want to understand why she made the decisions she made, decisions that people are literally still arguing about today, you really have to understand how those 3 identities overlapped.
I'm particularly excited to dig into the science part.
Yeah.
Because, I had no idea she was a chemist.
Sometimes people don't.
Right. I just assumed she studied, Latin or history like everyone else in Parliament.
No, and that difference is fundamental.
Right.
But we should probably start at the very beginning.
The foundation. Section 1. From Grantham to Oxford. So our source puts us in Grantham, Lincolnshire, England. The date is October 13th, 1925. Margaret Thatcher is born. Her parents are Alfred Roberts and Beatrice.
And we really have to talk about the father here, Alfred Roberts.
Yeah, the source describes him as a politician and greengrocer, which feels like a very specific, very grounded combination of jobs.
It is arguably the most important combination in her life, because if you think about what a politician and greengrocer actually implies, on one hand, you have the retail aspect.
Right.
This isn't high finance on Wall Street. This is a local shop. You buy the cabbages, you sell the cabbages.
Never count the pennies.
Exactly. It's tangible economics. If you buy stock and it rots on the shelf, you lose money. There is no bailout.
No safety net.
Right. There's no debt financing to hide the loss. It's hard, practical reality. You simply cannot spend money you do not have.
So she's growing up literally watching the books being balanced every single night.
Precisely. And on the other hand, he's a local politician, a lay preacher, a counselor. So young Margaret is growing up in a house where the dinner table conversation is this constant, fascinating mix of what is the price of butter and how do we run the town?
Oh, wow.
She's absorbing this idea that economics and politics aren't these abstract concepts taught in some university lecture hall. They're the actual things that keep the shop running and the streetlights on.
It grounds her politics in a very specific reality right from day one. It's not theoretical at all. It's about paying the bills.
It's what people call the grocer's daughter worldview. And she never lost it. Even when she was managing a massive G7 economy decades later, she treated it like the household budget.
Now, the source mentions her mother, Beatrice, but it really highlights that Margaret herself had a serious academic drive very early on. She went to Key Stephen and Grantham Girls' School. But she didn't just walk in, did she?
No, she didn't. She won a scholarship.
And that really stands out to me. She didn't come from the aristocracy.
Not at all.
She wasn't part of the old boys network. She had to test her way in.
And that introduces the concept of meritocracy into her life at a very young age. If you fundamentally believe that you got where you are solely because you worked harder and were smarter than the person sitting next to you, you tend to build a worldview that expects everyone else to do exactly the same thing.
That makes a lot of sense.
It creates a very high standard, but also it creates a certain intolerance for excuses. She didn't get a leg up. She had to climb the wall herself.
And once she was over the wall, she didn't just coast either. The source notes she was head girl for the academic year 1942 to 1943. And her school reports, they use words like academic consistency and brilliance in extracurricular activities.
Head girl is such a telling title for her to hold.
Why is that?
Because it's not just about being the smartest kid in the class. It's a leadership role.
Yeah.
It's about enforcing the rules, setting the standard, being the primary example for the younger students. It implies that from a teenage age, she respected institutions. She respected hierarchy. But she wanted to be the one at the top of that hierarchy.
She wanted to be in charge.
Exactly. She wasn't the rebel smoking behind the bike sheds. She was the one running the school assembly.
So she conquers Grantham. She's the head girl. She's the scholarship kid. Then comes the next big leap. 1946, she heads to Oxford College. And this is where the unlikely path really kicks in for me as I was reading the transcripts.
This is definitely the divergence point.
Right, because you expect a future prime minister to study politics, philosophy, economics, the famous PPE degree.
Which is the degree that teaches you how to argue, how to view history, how to interpret narratives, and craft policy.
But Margaret, she goes for a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry.
And in 1947, she graduated with second-class honors.
Okay, so help me out here. Help the listeners out. How does knowing the periodic table or how to titrate a chemical solution help you run a country? Because on paper, it seems completely disconnected.
I would actually argue it's the most connected thing about her. Think about how a scientist is trained to think versus how a lawyer or a historian is trained. A scientist looks for laws, natural laws.
Input and output.
Exactly. If you mix chemical A with chemical B under specific conditions, you're going to get reaction C. It doesn't matter if you feel like it should be different.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you think reaction C is unfair. It is an immutable law of nature, cause and effect.
So it's empirical. It's entirely black and white.
Precisely. Now, apply that mindset to a national economy. Most politicians look at economics as a negotiation. They think, maybe we can print a little more money and everyone will be happy. A chemist looks at it and says, no.
No negotiation.
Right. If you increase the money supply without increasing production, you get inflation. It is a formula. You cannot negotiate with the laws of mathematics.
That is such a cool way to look at it. She's diagnosing the country like a lab experiment.
I really think she was. She approached governance with that scientific rigor. This is the hypothesis, this is the method, and these are the results. And she just didn't have much patience for people who tried to argue with the results based on sentiment or emotion.
But she wasn't just locked away in the lab with her Bunsen burner all day. The source mentions that while she was at Oxford, she became the president of the Oxford University Conservative Association.
Which is a huge role to take on. And remember the context here. This is 1946. This is right after World War II. The Labour Party has just won a massive landslide victory in the general election. Socialism is absolutely on the rise. The national mood is shifting heavily to the left.
And here she is, a young woman at Oxford, actively planting her flag for the Conservatives.
It shows that her political alignment was formed very early on. And more importantly, she was willing to stand up and lead a group that was, at that specific moment, historically on the back foot. She wasn't afraid to be completely out of step with the zeitgeist.
And after Oxford, she actually works as a scientist, right? The source says she moved to Essex to work as a chemist for BX Plastics.
Which, again, gives her a very real connection to the world of industry. She's not just talking about factories in theory. She's wearing a lab coat, working in the materials sector. She understands production. She understands that things actually have to be made before they can be sold.
So we have the grocer's daughter, the head girl, the Oxford chemist, and the plastics researcher. That is already a resume that would make most people tired, but she's literally just getting started. This brings us to section 2, breaking barriers.
The entry into the arena.
Exactly, 1950. She decides to run for parliament. She becomes the Conservative contender for the Dartford Labour Party seat. Now, Dartford was a massive Labour stronghold, wasn't it? This was kind of a sacrificial lamb situation.
Oh, absolutely. Political parties often send their young, unproven candidates to fight seats they know they can't possibly win.
Right, to test them out.
It's a way to blood them, to get them some experience on the stump without risking a safe Conservative seat.
But she didn't treat it like a practice run at all. The source says she became an instant media magnet. And the reasons are pretty stark. She was the youngest representative running, and she was the only female candidate at the time.
Let's just pause and sit with that for a moment. The only female candidate.
It's hard to even imagine that today.
In 1950, politics was overwhelmingly a men's club. It was smoke-filled rooms, men in gray suits, late-night drinking sessions. For a 24-year-old woman to walk into that environment, the pressure must have been just immense.
Did she try to blend in? Did she try to be, one of the boys?
Just the opposite. The source calling her a media magnet suggests she leaned into it. She realized that being the only one made her visible. If the cameras were going to stare at her because she was a woman, she was going to make sure they heard her message while they were looking.
It speaks to that resilience we talked about earlier. She takes a perceived disadvantage and turns it into a platform.
And it shows she had a very thick skin. You have to if you're going to be the first or the only in any room.
Now, amidst all this campaigning, her personal life is moving forward too. She marries Sir Dennis Thatcher in December 1951.
Dennis is such a crucial figure in the background of her life. He had money, he had success in business, but most importantly, he seemed completely secure in himself.
He didn't mind being in her shadow.
He didn't need to be the star. He provided the financial and emotional stability that allowed Margaret to take these massive political risks.
And shortly after, in 1953, she gives birth to twins, Mark and Carol.
A massive life event.
And the source notes that because of the birth of the twins, she couldn't contest the 1955 general election, which makes complete sense. Twins are a handful.
Even the Iron Lady has to deal with the logistics of childcare. It shows she was human. There were constraints on her time.
But not that many constraints, because this next part of the transcript just blows my mind. In 1952, essentially while pregnant, or as a brand new mother of twins, she decides, you know what I'm missing? Another degree. She studies law and qualifies as a barrister.
This is the completion of the triple threat we mentioned. Scientist, politician, lawyer.
But why law? She was already a chemist. She was already a political candidate. Why add the stress of the bar exam on top of twins?
Because if chemistry gave her the logic, law gave her the language. Parliament is a legislature. It makes laws. If you want to dominate the House of Commons, you can't just have good ideas. You have to know how to construct an airtight argument.
Right.
You need to know how to dismantle your opponent's case, piece by piece.
It's basically combat training.
Exactly. Barrister training is intensive training in how to win an argument. It teaches you to think on your feet, to spot the flaw in the other person's logic instantly, and to speak with absolute authority.
It connects right back to that opening quote. I love argument. She literally trained professionally in how to argue.
She was building the perfect toolkit for a prime minister. Think about it. The economic grounding of the grocer, the empirical logic of the chemist, the rhetorical sharpness of the lawyer. By the time she actually got a seat in Parliament, she was incredibly formidable.
So she's got the skills. Now she needs the seat. Section 3. The Ascent to Power. 1959. She wins her first election campaign for the seat of Finchley in London.
And she's in. The journey from Grantham to Westminster is complete.
She climbs the ranks pretty steadily from there. The source says she was appointed to the Shadow Cabinet in 1967. But the real turning point seems to be the mid-70s.
The mid-70s were a very chaotic time for British politics. The source notes that the Conservative Party lost power in 1974.
Defeat creates a vacuum, doesn't it?
It does. When a party loses an election, the old guard is automatically discredited. The party membership starts looking around and asking, well, the old way didn't work. Who has a new idea? Who has a different energy?
And in steps Margaret. The source says she soon became a dominant force in her political arena and was elected leader of the Conservative Party in 1975.
Which was a massive shock to the system. The Conservatives were traditionally the party of the establishment, the aristocracy. And here was this woman, this grocer's daughter from Grantham, pushing past all the grandees to take the helm.
And 4 years later, she takes it all. May 4th, 1979, she's appointed Prime Minister.
A truly historic date.
But, and there was always a but in these stories, the Britain she inherited wasn't exactly a prize. The source describes the state of Britain in 1979 as being in a dire financial crisis.
That is almost an understatement. It was the era known as the Winter of Discontent. Trash was literally piling up in the streets because of union strikes. The dead were going unburied in some places. Rampant inflation. The country felt like it was in terminal decline. She didn't walk into a booming economy, she walked into a burning building.
And this brings us to Section 4, the economic overhaul. She needed a fix, and she found one in a new economic theory. The source calls it monetarism.
Monetarism.
Okay, I hear this word thrown around in history books all the time, but can we break it down? What is the deep dive explanation of monetarism for our listeners?
Okay, simply put, for a long time, the prevailing economic idea, which was Keynesianism, was that if the economy is slowing down, the government should print money and spend it to create jobs, pump the gas.
Right, economic stimulus.
Monetarism says no. If you print money you don't actually have, you just make the money worth less. That's what inflation is. Thatcher's view, heavily influenced by this theory, was that inflation was the ultimate enemy. It destroyed savings. To fix the economy, you have to control the money supply. You have to stop the printing press. You have to tighten the belt.
It sounds like the grocer's daughter logic coming back with a vengeance.
It is exactly that. It's don't spend what you haven't earned, but applied to a G7 nation.
But the actual application of it, that's where it gets really painful, right?
But extremely painful, because tightening the belt on a national scale means drastically cutting government spending. It means letting lame duck industries fail because the government simply won't bail them out anymore. It means unemployment going up in the short term to cure the inflation in the long term.
And speaking of radical changes, let's talk about taxes. This part of the source material actually made me do a double take. The shifts in the tax code were massive.
They were revolutionary for the time.
The source says she reduced income tax rates from a staggering 98% down to 40%.
Just let that number sink in. 98%.
Wait, I really want to make sure I understand this correctly. That implies that for every pound you earned above a certain threshold, the government kept 98 pence, and you kept 2 pence.
That was the harsh reality for the highest earners in Britain before these reforms. It was essentially a confiscatory tax rate. The idea behind it was to redistribute wealth. But the argument against it, the argument Thatcher made, is fundamentally about psychology.
The psychology of work.
Exactly. If I tell you that for your next hour of hard work, I'm going to take 98% of your pay, are you going to work that hour?
Absolutely not. I'm going home.
Right. Or you're moving your money to Switzerland. Or you're just not starting that new business venture at all. The economy was stagnant because the incentives were completely broken. Her radical move, slashing it to 40%, was about saying, We want to incentivize wealth creation. We want you to keep more of what you earn so you will earn more, and that resulting activity will drive the entire economy forward.
She also slashed corporate income tax rates from 52% down to 35%.
Same exact logic. Britain is open for business. She wanted to turn the UK from a slow, state-run, heavily taxed economy into a dynamic, capitalist one.
But not all her tax ideas were hits. The source mentions she replaced local government taxes with something called the poll tax. And even the source foreshadows this as a very controversial move.
The poll tax, yes, that was the overreach. We'll get to the fallout of that a bit later, but it serves as a stark reminder that her I love argument style definitely had a downside. Sometimes, if you refuse to listen to people who disagree with you, you walk right off a cliff.
So she's shaking up the economy. But by the early 80s, things were still pretty tough. Unemployment was still high. However, the source notes that the government began gaining popularity after their success in the Falklands War.
This is Section 5, Crisis and Conflict. The Falklands War in 1982 was the pivot point of her entire premiership.
Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, which is a British territory in the South Atlantic.
And you really have to understand the global perception at that specific time. People thought Britain was finished as a world power. They looked at the UK and thought, they can't even pick up their own trash in London. How on earth are they going to fight a war 8,000 miles away?
But the chemist had a different formula.
She did. She looked at the aggression and said, this cannot stand. She sent the naval task force. It was a massive military and political gamble.
And the result was a victory. The source says this led to her re-election in 1983 with a growing conservative majority.
It completely validated her. It proved to the public she wasn't just tough on taxes, she was tough on national defense. It restored a sense of national pride that had been missing. The Iron Lady wasn't just a nickname anymore, it was a literal description of her resolve.
And she needed that strength, because 1984 brought one of the biggest internal conflicts in British history. The miners' strike.
The domestic war.
The source identifies this as a critical event. The miners protested the closure of, and I'm reading the phonetic spelling straight from the source here, MEK pits.
Ah, yes. I believe the source text there is referring phonetically to uneconomic pits.
Oh, uneconomic. That makes perfect sense.
And this is where the two worldviews we've been discussing really crash into each other violently. For the miners, a coal pit isn't just a business, it's a community. It's a way of life. It's generations of history. You don't close it just because the math is bad this year.
But Thatcher, the grocer's daughter.
She looks at the balance sheet. She sees a pit that costs more to run than the coal coming out of it is actually worth. To her, it's subsidies, it's waste, it's inefficiency dragging down the state. She says, you cannot run a national business on sentiment.
The source says she forced the miners back to work with no allowances.
That phrase, no allowances, is brutal. She simply didn't blink. Previous governments had often compromised with the powerful trade unions just to keep the lights on and avoid strikes. Thatcher prepared for this battle. She stockpiled coal for months beforehand. She used the police to ensure non-striking miners could get to work. She viewed it as a fundamental battle for the soul of the country. Who runs Britain? The elected government in Westminster or the trade union leaders?
Connect this back to that opening quote for me. I love argument.
It's the perfect example of it in action. A consensus-driven leader might have said, okay, let's keep a few pits open to keep the peace, let's compromise. Thatcher sought to win the argument definitively. She essentially destroyed the political power of the unions. It was an unconditional victory for her ideology, but the social scar tissue in those mining communities is still very much there today.
But it wasn't just political battles she was fighting. It was literally life and death. The source mentions that during her second term, in 1984, she survived an assassination attempt.
That was the Brayton hotel bombing. The IRA planted a massive time bomb in the hotel where the Conservative Party conference was being held. They were actively trying to wipe out her and the entire cabinet.
The fact that she survived an attempt on her life and, as the history goes, continued with her scheduled conference speech the very next day.
It added immeasurably to this mythos of invincibility. It showed a physical courage to match her political courage. You couldn't scare her away from the podium. You couldn't blow her up. She just kept going.
Let's pivot to the global stage. Section 6. Global policy. Because she wasn't just fighting miners and winning domestic elections. She was making massive moves internationally.
Indeed, she was.
The source points out two major relationships, China and the USA.
Both absolutely crucial to her legacy.
In 1984, she signed a treaty with the Chinese government, regarding the future of Hong Kong.
This was the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It officially set the clock ticking for the handover of Hong Kong in 1997. It required immense diplomatic skill. She was negotiating the complex transfer of a major, thriving capitalist city to a communist regime. She had to be highly pragmatic.
And then there's the U.S. relationship. In 1991, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Ronald Reagan. That is the highest civilian honor in the United States.
The Thatcher-Reagan alliance was pivotal for the late 20th century. They were true ideological soulmates, both firm believers in free markets, smaller government, and standing incredibly tough against the Soviet Union. They amplified each other's power on the world stage. That medal was really the capstone of a very special relationship.
Back at home, she gets reelected for a third term in 1987. She just keeps winning these elections.
A third consecutive term is rare territory in British politics.
And in this third term, the source says she sought to implement a standard scholastic curriculum across the country.
This became known as the national curriculum. Before this, local schools had a huge amount of autonomy. You might learn one thing in Manchester and something totally different in a school in London. She wanted standards. She wanted to ensure that every single child, regardless of where they lived, learned the core concepts. Again, it's that underlying drive for meritocracy. Give everyone the exact same academic foundation so they can all compete fairly.
She also tried to initiate a socialized medical system, according to the source. Now wait, Britain already had the National Health Service, the NHS, so what does this actually mean?
I believe the source is referring to the internal market reforms she tried to push through. She tried to make the huge, sprawling bureaucracy of the NHS more efficient by introducing market competition into it, having hospitals act more like independent businesses, managing their own budgets, competing for patients.
Trying to bring the grocer's logic into the hospital ward.
Exactly. But healthcare is a lot more emotional for people than coal mining. People generally don't like thinking of their local hospitals as competing businesses. It was incredibly controversial.
And interestingly, amidst all this heavy politics, the science background comes back. In 1983, she was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society.
That is a huge, huge honor. It's usually reserved for practicing scientists who have made major peer-reviewed discoveries. For a sitting prime minister to be elected, it acknowledges that unique background we talked about at the start, the chemist PM. The Royal Society was essentially nodding to one of their own.
So she wins the 1989 general elections, according to our source material.
She was a deeply formidable campaigner.
But nothing lasts forever. Section 7. The end of an era. The departure, when it finally comes, is pretty abrupt. The source says she was replaced after the 1992 general elections.
The source timeline is a little condensed there in its phrasing, but the sequence of events is clear. She didn't lose an election to the Labour Party. She was removed by her own people.
The source says she was replaced by her chancellor, John Major.
The text identifies him as John Major. Historically, we know that refers to John Major, but the key takeaway from the source is that he was her chancellor, her right-hand man in the Treasury.
So it was an inside job.
It was a political coup. Remember that poll tax we mentioned? It had literally caused riots in the streets. Her style, that I love argument approach, had finally worn her colleagues down. They felt she was no longer listening to anyone. They felt her unpopularity was going to lead them to a massive defeat. So the men in gray suits finally came to her and said, "It's over. You have to step down."
Even the Iron Lady can rest, I guess.
Or at least the political structure supporting her can fatigue and collapse.
But she didn't just disappear into the night. In 1992, she was appointed to the House of Lords as Baroness Thatcher of Kesteven.
Kesteven. Bringing it right back to her roots. Remember Kesteven in Grantham Girls' School?
Oh, right.
It's a nice bit of circularity. She returns to the formal title of her childhood home region.
She lived for another 2 decades after that. The source tells us she died on April 8, 2013 in Westminster, London. She was 87 years old. The cause was a stroke.
A quiet end to a very, very loud life.
So let's zoom out for a minute. We've gone through the timeline, from the grocery store all the way to the House of Lords. What is the main takeaway here for our listeners?
I think we have to look at the sheer scale of the transformation she oversaw. She took a country that was, as the source said, in a dire financial crisis, paralyzed by constant strikes and punitively high taxes, and she forcefully hammered it into a completely new shape.
She slashed that top tax rate from 98% down to 40%. She broke the miners' strike. She went to war in the Falklands.
She was a force of nature, and she did it all as a complete outsider. A woman operating in a man's world, a scientist in a world of rhetoricians, a grocer's daughter sitting among aristocrats.
And she never apologized for it. That's what really sticks with me. That quote we started with. I don't expect anyone just to sit there and agree with me.
Because she understood that true leadership often means telling people things they really do not want to hear. She was completely willing to be disliked in order to be effective.
It's a powerful contrast to today. We are so used to leaders who chase daily approval ratings. Thatcher chased long-term results.
And whether you agree with her policies or not, and I want to be clear, plenty of people strongly disagree with them and point to the lasting social costs, you cannot deny the effectiveness of her method. She had a hypothesis, she ran the national experiment, and she stood firmly by the results.
The chemist prime minister. So here is the question I want to leave you with today. We live in an era of consensus building, of soft power, of constantly trying to keep everyone happy and united. Margaret Thatcher was the exact opposite of that. She thrived on conflict. She invited the argument. So in a world of modern politics that is so often focused on likability, what can we actually learn from a leader who explicitly stated she didn't want agreement? Does effective leadership require being disagreeable?
That is the ultimate question. Can you really change the world if you're too afraid to upset it?
Something to think about. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're basically clearing the desk, turning off all the notifications, and just really focusing on a stack of notes that tells a story so dramatic that honestly...
It's a lot.
It is. Like if you pitch this as a movie script, Hollywood would probably tell you to tone it down.
Oh, absolutely. They'd say it's just too much.
Way too much.
You know, we cover a lot of topics on this show. We cover tech, we do history, science.
Yeah.
But every once in a while, we get a topic that feels less like a historical biography and more like a Greek tragedy.
Yeah.
Or, you know, a Shakespearean play.
Totally.
Because you have the weight of a massive dynasty. You have the total chaos of war, espionage, courtrooms, prison cells, family tragedy, and ultimately assassination.
Yeah.
And it is all packed into just one single life.
Right. And we were talking, of course, about Indira Gandhi.
Yes.
And I want to be super clear right off the bat here. We aren't just talking about a prime minister.
No.
We are talking about a woman who defined an entire era of Indian history. We're going to be looking at her absolute power, her crushing fall, and what I really think is one of the most unbelievable political resurrections in modern history.
And to really ground us before we start, let's look at the very first thing our source material points out.
Okay.
This is from the biography we're using from Famous People Bio, and it's a statistic that honestly just stops you in your tracks.
Yeah, it got me too.
To this day, Indira Gandhi remains the only female prime minister of India.
That is just wild, isn't it?
It's incredible.
I mean, I actually had to go and double check that when I was reading the notes because it just feels like it cannot be true.
But it is. I mean, think about the decades that have passed since she died. Think about how much the world has changed since the 80s.
Right.
How many elections have happened, how the population over there has just exploded. And yet, she stands entirely alone in that distinction.
It really contextualizes just how unique her position was.
It does. That fact alone tells you that we are dealing with a total force of nature. This wasn't someone who just, you know, slid into power because it was her turn.
Right.
This was someone who carved a path where there absolutely wasn't one. It tells you about the sheer force of personality and the circumstance required to get her there.
And to keep her there.
Exactly.
So here is our mission for today's deep dive. We have the dates, we have the timeline from the biography source, but we aren't here to just recite a calendar to you.
No, anyone can go read a Wikipedia page for that.
Exactly. We want to understand the actual trajectory. We really want to figure out how a shy young woman, born right into the very center of a freedom struggle, rises to hold absolute unchecked power, loses it all in this humiliating defeat, and then, and this is the part I honestly still can't completely wrap my head around, she fights her way all the way back to the top.
Right. We really need to connect the dots between the what and the why.
Yes.
How does the daughter of a Democrat become the Iron Lady who ends up suspending democracy?
Right.
And what did that actually cost her? We are going to look at the source material to trace that entire arc from the quiet student to the woman who literally redrew the map of South Asia.
I'm so ready for this. Let's get into part one, the roots of a dynasty.
Let's do it.
So the story starts on November 19th, 1917. She's born in Allahabad. And just looking at the context of that specific year, the whole world is basically on fire.
Literally on fire.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just zoom out for a second and look at 1917, World War I is just wrapping up. The Russian Revolution is completely shaking up the global order.
Empires are crumbling everywhere.
Right. Empires are falling apart. And inside India specifically, the freedom struggle against the British Empire is really starting to find its legs.
It's escalating.
Exactly. It's moving from a polite request for some basic rights to a hard demand for absolute freedom.
And India is born right into the epicenter of that Indian struggle.
She is. She isn't born in some quiet village on the periphery where she's insulated from it all. She is born in Allahabad, right inside the Nehru household.
And her lineage isn't just impressive, it's heavy.
Very heavy.
Talk about pressure. Her father is Jawaharlal Nehru, who obviously goes on to become independent India's very first prime minister. That is a massive legacy to live up to.
It is immense. But the source actually makes a very specific point to mention her mother, too, Kamala Nehru. And the text explicitly calls her a freedom fighter.
Which I really think is an important distinction to make, because so often in these historical notes, the whys just get completely sidelined.
Oh, it's a huge distinction, because it means Indira didn't just have a politician for a dad who went off to work and then came home to a normal domestic life.
Right.
Her entire domestic life was the revolution. Most people learn about politics in a civics class, or maybe by reading the newspaper when they get older.
Sure.
Indira Gandhi inhaled it. It was the very atmosphere of her home from the day she was born.
You just have to imagine that dinner table. You aren't talking about school grades or sports. You're talking about independence.
The sedition laws.
Right. Sedition laws, protests, the entire future of the nation.
Exactly. She was born directly into a movement. Her inheritance wasn't just old money or social status, it was a cause. And that completely shapes a child's psychology. You realize very early on that your life actually belongs to something much bigger than yourself. You realize that normalcy is just a luxury you do not have.
Which really brings us to her education. Because if you were writing the resume for a future prime minister, especially one coming from a dynasty like this, you'd expect a very straight line.
The golden path.
Exactly. Top boarding school, top university, law degree, and then straight into politics.
Right.
But her path was incredibly messy. The word interrupted is probably the best word for it.
It was incredibly fragmented.
So the notes say she starts with preliminary education at home, does her matriculation via school, then she enrolls at Viswavarti University in Calcutta.
Which is a very prestigious, culturally rich place.
But she doesn't stay there.
No, she has to leave. And the reason is quite tragic. It's her mother's ailing health in Europe. Kamala Nehru was very sick, and Indira just had to drop everything to go be with her.
And this is a recurring theme we are going to see again and again in her life. This intense collision between her personal duties, her family, and her own personal development. She drops everything to go to Europe.
It's this massive burden of care. She is a young woman, but she is already playing the role of the primary caretaker, the constant companion in illness.
Yeah.
And that changes you. I think it matures you much faster than any university lecture ever could.
But then she does get what looks like the golden ticket. She enrolls at the University of Oxford in Britain.
The absolutely classic path for the elite. It was basically the finishing school for the British Empire's future leaders.
And ironically, for the leaders who would go on to dismantle that empire.
Right.
So she's at Oxford, studying history, political science, economics. It's the perfect toolkit for a future leader. And usually, this is the exact spot where the biography says, and she graduated with honors, was a valedictorian and returned to save her country.
But that is not what happens here.
Not at all. The source is very clear that she never actually completed the degree. It says constant ill health forced her to return to India without the degree.
I really love this detail. I do.
Why is that?
Because we have this tendency to think of these monolithic historical figures as having these perfect, unblemished records. We think of them as superhuman almost.
Right, like they never failed a test.
Exactly. But here is one of the most powerful women of the entire 20th century, a woman who commanded huge armies and massive economies, and technically speaking, she's an Oxford dropout.
It totally challenges the whole notion of what a qualification actually is, doesn't it? Like, what actually prepares a person to rule a country?
It really does. And I think it points to something much deeper about her character. Later in life, the source quotes her saying that experience brings its own maturity.
Wow.
And I think her time in Europe, managing her mother's severe illness, watching the whole world tip into World War II, because remember, she was in Europe as the clouds of war were actively gathering.
Oh, that's right.
That was her real education.
She basically traded the classroom for the real world.
Precisely. She didn't get the degree on paper, but she got resilience. She learned how to survive. She learned how to navigate intense crisis. And in the rough and tumble world of Indian politics, those survival skills are worth a whole lot more than a diploma on the wall.
So she's back in India. It's the early 1940s. The independence movement is really reaching a fever pitch now. The British are on their way out, even if they don't quite know it yet. And she makes a major move in her personal life.
Right.
On March 26, 1942, she marries Feroz Gandhi.
Which begins the next major chapter of her personal life. They go on to have two sons, Rajiv and Sanjay.
Okay, I want to pause right here and just put a massive red pin in the name Sanjay Gandhi.
That is a very good instinct. Why do you say that?
Because usually in these political bios, the kids are just footnotes until the very end of the text. You know, it usually just says she was survived by her two loving sons, and that's it.
Right.
But reading ahead through these notes, it heavily implies that Sanjay is way more than just a background character in this story.
Oh, absolutely. Sanjay is going to be central to the drama. He isn't just a son who stands on the balcony and waves. He becomes a political operator, a strict enforcer, and eventually a major catalyst for some of her biggest, most controversial decisions.
We will definitely get to the controversy later.
We certainly will. But for now, in the 40s and 50s, he's just a child. Indira is a young mother. She's back in India, and she's watching the British Raj finally completely collapse.
And she watches her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, take the helm as the very first prime minister of a free India.
Right.
So at this point, she is the prime minister's daughter. She is acting as the official hostess. She is his close confidant. But she isn't the ruler herself.
Not yet. She is deep in the inner circle, but she isn't the one holding the scepter.
Let's jump forward then to 1964. This is the big seismic shift, part 2, the political apprenticeship and ascension.
This is exactly where the ground completely shifts beneath her feet.
Jawaharlal Nehru, the founding father, the absolute giant of Indian politics, passes away.
Now, in a monarchical system, or a true dynasty in the traditional historical sense, the crown would just pass directly to the child. The king is dead, long live the queen.
Right.
But India is a vibrant, chaotic, massive democracy, and Indira doesn't just grab the microphone the day after the funeral and declare herself the leader.
No, she enters what I'd probably call her apprenticeship phase. It seems almost cautious from the notes.
It is very cautious. She is grieving her father, first of all, but she is also strategically maneuvering. She gets appointed to the Rajya Sabha, which is the upper house of parliament, and she joins the cabinet of the brand new prime minister, Lal Bahadur Shastri.
She actually becomes the Minister of Information and Broadcasting.
Right.
Now, for you listening who might not be huge political junkies, is that considered a very powerful position?
It's significant, certainly. I mean, you control the national narrative, you control the radio, and All India Radio was absolutely huge at the time. You handle the media, it gives you a very public voice. But it's not the true power center of the government. It's not the home minister who controls the police and internal security. It's not the finance minister who controls all the money.
Right. It's not the heavy hitter roles.
Exactly. It feels like a role where she could really learn the ropes of governance without being in the direct line of fire.
It feels like she was mostly observing, seeing exactly how the machinery of the government works from the inside, but not actually driving the car quite yet.
Exactly. She is seeing how the files move, how the massive Indian bureaucracy stalls things or advances things. She is learning where all the levers are.
But that apprenticeship was incredibly short.
Tragically short, yes.
Lal Bahadur Shastri dies in 1966. Just 2 years later, suddenly, there is a major vacancy at the very top again.
And this is where the sheer speed of her ascent is just breathtaking. Her father dies in 64. She joins the cabinet. Just 2 years later, January 1966, she is officially sworn in as the Prime Minister of India.
That is just a meteoric rise. I mean, going from a grieving daughter and a junior minister to the leader of the world's largest democracy in roughly 24 months.
It is stunning, and we really have to analyze why that happened. Why did they choose her?
Was it just the name?
The name was a huge part of it, for sure. The Nehru name was absolute magic with the voters, but there's another deeper layer here. You have to wonder what the old guard of the political party was actually thinking.
The power brokers behind the scenes.
Exactly. The syndicate, as they were known, there is a lot of historical analysis out there that suggests they supported her specifically because they thought she would be highly malleable.
Malleable, like easily pushed around.
Yes. They thought she would be easy to control. They looked at her and saw a woman, relatively inexperienced in top leadership, Nehru's daughter, perhaps a bit shy in public, and they thought, great.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. They thought, we put her in the main chair, she gets us all the votes because of her magical last name, but we will be the ones pulling the strings. We will actually run the country from the back seat.
Ah, the classic mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Underestimating someone entirely because of their gender or their quiet demeanor.
If they really thought that, they were in for a severely rude awakening.
To put it very mildly, they thought they were hiring a puppet, and instead they got a master operator.
They essentially handed the keys over to someone who had absolutely no intention of letting anyone else drive the car.
Which brings us perfectly into part 3, the radical reformer. Because once she gets that chair, she doesn't just keep it warm for the syndicate. She starts rearranging the entire house.
Rearranging is a very polite way to put it. She basically takes a sledgehammer to the existing economic structure of the country. The source actually uses the word radical to describe her policies, and it absolutely fits.
Yeah.
She wasn't just tweaking tax rates by 1 or 2%, she was changing the fundamental nature of the Indian state.
Let's really look at this nationalization wave the source talks about.
Yeah.
Because it's huge. She brings 14 major commercial banks directly under government control.
Let's stop and unpack that for a second for everyone listening. Nationalizing the banks. Today, in our current economic climate, that sounds like sort of dry academic economic policy.
Right.
But imagine if the President of the United States went on television tomorrow night and just said, okay, Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citi, you all belong to the federal government now. The private shareholders are out. We are in charge.
It would be absolute chaos. It would be a full-scale revolution. Wall Street would completely melt down.
Exactly. It was a totally seismic move. By taking over those banks, Indira Gandhi was effectively seizing control of the entire country's financial bloodstream.
But why do that? What was the actual logic behind such an extreme move?
Well, before she did this, the banks were mostly owned by large private industrial houses. And naturally, who do they lend money to? They lent money to their friends, to other big businesses, to highly profitable ventures.
Makes sense for a private bank.
Right. But agriculture, small farmers, the rural poor, they weren't getting any credit at all. So by nationalizing them, she could force the banks to direct credit to farmers, to small entrepreneurs, to the poor.
So it was essentially a massive populist move?
Highly populist and also highly strategic politically. It completely cut the funding lines of her political rivals, the big industrialists, and it endeared her to the massive rural voting base.
Wow.
It was a brutal power move, cleverly disguised as economic reform. It sent a very clear message. The government is the ultimate power here, not the rich elites.
But she didn't just stop at banks. The list in these notes is staggering. Coal, steel, copper refining, cotton textiles.
Insurance.
These are what economists refer to as the commanding heights of the economy. Energy, heavy infrastructure, finance. By taking all of these over, she was signaling that the state, and by extension her own administration, was the primary driver of India's entire destiny.
It's centralization on a massive, massive scale.
It is. It's the Iron Lady really beginning to forge the iron. And oil. The source specifically mentions she nationalized the oil companies and notes it was specifically after the 1971 war.
Which is pure strategic security. You cannot fight modern wars if you do not control your own fuel supply. If foreign private companies own your oil, they can simply turn off the tap when you need it most. She wanted to make absolutely sure India held the tap.
But it wasn't just heavy economics, though. The source mentions social reforms, too. It says she introduced constitutional clauses for equal pay for equal work for both men and women.
Which is incredibly progressive for that era. Remember, she is the only female prime minister. And while she didn't always campaign strictly as a feminist in the modern Western sense of the word, this specific policy cemented gender equity directly into the legal framework of the Indian workplace.
A huge deal. She was legally saying, labor is labor, entirely regardless of gender.
Exactly. She was rapidly modernizing the social contract at the exact same time she was centralizing the economy. She was building a state that was incredibly powerful, yes, but also one that legally promised to look after the vulnerable women, the poor, the farmers.
So picture this situation. She is radically reshaping the economy. She is pushing major social reform. She is rapidly consolidating her own power. She is truly becoming the Iron Lady. But to truly cement that title in history, she needed a test. A really big one.
And every great leader needs a crisis to define them. In 1971, she got hers.
This brings us to part 4, the war, the map maker,
The geographic and historical context here is so crucial to grasp. We're looking at 1971.
And massive trouble is brewing right next door, the Pakistan Civil War.
Now, to clarify this for the listener, because the geography from back then can be a little tricky if you don't know it, at this specific time, Pakistan wasn't just one contiguous block of land like it is today. It was actually split into two separate chunks. You had West Pakistan, which is what we know as Pakistan today, and East Pakistan, which is what we now call Bangladesh.
And they were separated by what, 1,000 miles?
Yes, roughly 1,000 miles of Indian territory right in the middle of them.
That just sounds like a complete logistical nightmare for running a single country.
It was a nightmare. And politically, it was a total powder keg. East Pakistan constantly felt marginalized, economically exploited, and culturally suppressed by the government in the West. And in 1971, that powder keg finally exploded. The West Pakistani military launched a shockingly brutal crackdown on the East.
And the fallout from that violence landed right on India's doorstep.
Literally on the doorstep. Refugees were pouring across the border into India by the absolute millions. They were fleeing horrific violence. It became a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions overnight, and India's resources were being severely drained trying to feed and house everyone.
And Indira Gandhi has a really tough choice to make. Does she stay out of it? I mean, technically, it's an internal civil matter for Pakistan, right? Or does she intervene?
And this is the exact moment where she shows her famous decisiveness. She chooses to intervene. She openly supports East Pakistan.
And this wasn't just, sending some blankets and food over the border.
No, she actively toured all the major world capitals to build a geopolitical case. And then, when the timing was perfectly right, it turned into a full-scale hot war.
And the outcome?
Historic. In just 13 days, less than 2 weeks, the war was completely over. The Pakistani army in the east formally surrendered, and a brand new nation was born, Bangladesh.
Just think about that for a second. How many leaders in modern history can casually say, I helped physically create a new country?
Very, very few. It wasn't just a military victory. It was an absolute geopolitical masterstroke. She split her primary rival, Pakistan, right in half, significantly reducing the military threat on her borders, and simultaneously installed a friendly, grateful government on her eastern flank.
She literally redrew the map of the world.
She was the map maker. It completely cemented her status as a global leader. She proved she was tough, she was highly capable, and she was victorious.
The source also mentions a small detail here about her administration granting statehood to Samaria.
Yes, the source mentions Samaria. Now, this is likely referring to the massive internal reorganization of Indian states that happened during her long tenure. She was extremely active in granting full statehood to various regions. For instance, Himachal Pradesh, or states in the northeast like Meghalaya, Manipur, and Tripura, all got statehood around 1971 and 72.
Okay.
The source might have a specific local name noted there, but the broader point remains that she was actively reorganizing things on all the maps, both external and internal.
So she's fixing the external international borders and redrawing the internal domestic borders.
Exactly. She is fundamentally organizing the nation to her vision.
But I want to ask you about the larger global context of this 1971 war. Because this is the 1970s. This is the absolute height of the Cold War. You have the U.S. heavily on one side, the USSR heavily on the other. A regional war like this usually drags the superpowers right into the mess. How did she handle them?
With just incredible dexterity. The source specifically notes she maintained good relationships with both the Soviet Union and the United States.
That sounds like an impossible tightrope walk.
It was a high-wire act with absolutely no net. You have to remember, the U.S., under President Lipson and Henry Kissinger at the time, was actually intensely hostile to India during this 1971 crisis.
Really?
Yes. They were heavily tilting towards Pakistan. They even sent the U.S. 7th Fleet, which is a massive nuclear-armed naval force, right into the Bay of Bengal, specifically to intimidate India and force them to back down.
That is genuinely terrifying.
It is. But Indira didn't blink at all. She had already signed a massive treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation with the Soviet Union just before the war started, specifically to counterbalance any potential U.S. threat. She played the two global superpowers against each other perfectly to protect India's interests.
She completely refused to be a pawn in their game.
Exactly. She made India a major player on the board. She showed the world that India wasn't just some client state, it was a regional hegemon in its own right.
And what about her ongoing relationship with the brand new nation, Bangladesh? Do they remain best friends forever?
Well, geopolitics is a deeply cynical game. The source mentions that initially, of course, the relationship was incredibly strong. She was seen as their great liberator.
Naturally.
But international relations are fickle. The source notes that unfortunately, after the assassination of Bangladesh's founding leader, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the bilateral ties soured significantly.
It really just goes to show there are no permanent friends in politics, only permanent interests. Even the very country you physically helped create can turn cool on you eventually.
Very true. But if you take a snapshot right in 1971, she is at the absolute peak of her power. She is viewed almost like Durga, the Hindu goddess of war.
Yeah.
She has nationalized the banks. She has decisively defeated Pakistan. She's created Bangladesh. She seems entirely invincible.
And yet, and this is why we do these deep dives, this is exactly where the story violently pivots. It's almost Shakespearean.
It really is the classic tragic arc.
Which brings us to part 5, the turning point. Justice versus power.
You know the old saying, pride goes before a fall.
Sure.
Well, in politics, sometimes it's victory goes before a massive lawsuit.
Right, because despite this incredible war victory, things aren't perfect at home. The opposition parties are absolutely furious with her. They officially accuse her of using unlawful methods and electoral fraud to win the 1971 elections.
Which is the very election that gave her the sweeping mandate to fight the war in the first place.
Exactly. And these aren't just complaints being shouted at random political rallies. They take it straight to the courts. The legal system kicks into high gear.
They take it to the Allahabad High Court. Now just imagine the sheer tension in the country. The sitting prime minister, the woman who literally just won a major war, the Empress of India, as some magazines called her, is being judged by a single judge in a local courtroom in Allahabad.
It really shows the incredible strength of the democratic institutions at the time. That a court could even entertain a case like this against such a dominant, powerful leader.
And in June 1975, the final verdict drops. And it is an absolute bombshell.
What was the exact verdict?
The court finds her guilty.
Guilty.
Yes.
Let's read the actual punishment from the notes because it is incredibly severe. The election is declared entirely null and void. She is officially unseated from the Lok Sabha, that's the lower house of parliament. And this is the real kicker here. She is banned from contesting any elections for 6 years.
This is a constitutional earthquake. The judiciary effectively just fired the sitting prime minister. They looked at her and said, you broke the rules, pack your bags, you're out of a job. It's a complete head-on collision between the executive branch and the judicial branch.
So here is the ultimate moment of truth. This is the ultimate character test for her. Does she respect the democratic institution? Does she step down gracefully and file an appeal? Or does she dig in and fight?
This is where the Iron Lady really shows her steel, but perhaps in a much darker shade than before. She absolutely does not step down.
The source says, quoting here, due to internal crises, she advises the president, Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed, to declare a formal state of emergency.
The emergency. It's a term that still carries a massive amount of trauma in Indian political history today. For many people, it is the single defining moment of her entire legacy.
It lasted from June 1975 all the way to March 1977. 21 full months.
And the source uses a very specific, very chilling phrase to describe her absolute power during this time. Rule by decree.
I really want to make sure you listening understand what that actually means in practice. What exactly is rule by decree?
It means the entire democratic rule book is just thrown straight out the window. Normally, if a leader wants to pass a new law, you have to go to parliament, you have a debate, the opposition argues against it, you have committees, you finally vote.
Right. It takes a long time. It takes building consensus.
Exactly. Rule by decree means the prime minister simply decides something, the president signs a piece of paper, and boom, it is law. Immediate, entirely unchallengeable. She bypassed the court's guilty decision by literally suspending the very system that created the court in the first place.
So she basically walked over and hit the pause button on the entire democracy.
She hit the stop button, really. Fundamental human rights were completely suspended. Strict censorship was heavily imposed on all the press. They couldn't print anything without approval. Major opposition leaders were dragged out of bed and arrested. It was, for all intents and purposes, a temporary authoritarian regime.
But why did she do it? Did she genuinely in her heart believe the country was in real danger of collapsing? Or was it just a naked power grab to save her own skin?
That is the million-dollar question that historians still furiously debate today. She publicly argued that there were massive internal disturbances, foreign plots to destabilize the country. She said the opposition was paralyzing the government with strikes and protests, and she needed strict order to continue her pro-poor economic reforms.
Well, what would her critics say to that?
Her critics would say she did it solely, 100%, to save herself from losing her job after that court verdict. That she simply put her own political career above the constitution of the nation.
Honestly, it's probably a bit of both, right?
Power usually is a mix. It's the dangerous belief that I am the absolute only one who can save this country, therefore I simply must stay in power at all costs.
But absolute power, at least in this specific case, had an expiration date. She extended the emergency twice. But eventually, in March 1977, she shockingly called for fresh elections.
This is such a fascinating psychological moment to analyze. Why call elections if you are already ruling by decree? You have all the power. Why risk losing it?
Maybe she missed the legitimacy of it.
I really think so. You have to remember, she was a Nehru. She was raised steeped in democracy. Deep down in her core, she craved the validation of the popular vote. She didn't want to just be a dictator. She wanted to be the chosen, beloved leader of the people.
Maybe she was living in a bubble and thought she was still super popular. Maybe she thought the people actually appreciated the stability she brought.
She highly likely thought the people were totally with her. The trains were running on time, as they say. She thought, I've brought discipline to the chaos. I've fixed the economy. They will obviously vote for me to stay.
Well, if she genuinely thought that, she was horribly wrong.
Oh.
Which brings us to part 6, the fall.
The 1977 election results were a landslide, but totally in the wrong direction for her.
It was an absolute slaughter at the polls.
The Congress Party, which had completely dominated Indian politics without interruption since independence, I mean, it was the party of Mahatma Gandhi, of Nehru, it was totally crushed. They won just 153 seats.
But the personal defeat was even more stinging than the national one. We have to look down at the local level. Both Indira Gandhi and her son Sanjay actually lost their own personal seats in parliament.
That just has to be rock bottom. Losing the prime ministership is one thing. That's national politics. The tides turn, you lose the majority. But losing your own specific district, that's your literal neighbors looking at you and saying, we do not want you representing us anymore.
It's a total repudiation. The voters looked at the emergency, they looked at the rule by decree, the controversial sterilization campaign spearheaded by Sanjay, the mass arrests of journalists and politicians, and they just said, no, we are done. They actively chose messy democracy over her forced stability.
And the humiliation didn't just stop at losing the election. The source details exactly what happened next. It gets so much worse for her.
Post-election, the brand new government comes in, and Indira and her son Sanjay were formally arrested.
Just imagine that visual for a second. The former prime minister, the woman who dined with kings and U.S. presidents, the woman who won a war, sitting in a stark jail cell.
And the charges were incredibly serious. The notes say they were charged with planning to kill opposition leaders during the emergency.
That is an incredibly heavy, dark accusation. Now, whether it was purely politically motivated retribution by the government, which was a coalition called the Janata Party, or whether it was a legitimate charge based on hard evidence, the final image is just stark. The woman who split Pakistan in two, who boldly nationalized the banks, sitting under arrest in police custody.
At this exact point, if you were watching this as a Hollywood movie, you'd think, okay, that's the end of the film. Roll the credits. She's out of power. She's publicly disgraced. She's arrested. Her political career is completely over.
99% of politicians would have just faded away right then. They would have gone home, written a defensive memoir to justify their actions, retired to a quiet, wealthy estate in the hills, and just vanished from public life.
But this is Indira Gandhi we were talking about.
She absolutely does not do retirement.
Part 7, the resurrection.
This is the part of the entire story that honestly feels highly improbable.
The very next year, 1978, she starts campaigning again. She finds a new seat to contest, and she actually wins back a spot in the Lok Sabha.
She practically claws her way back into parliament. She didn't sit at home and sulk. She went directly back to the people. She traveled endlessly across the country, visiting flood victims on elephants, reaching out to the rural poor. She brilliantly created a new narrative that she was a martyr being unfairly persecuted by the vindictive new government.
And what was that new government doing? The ones who arrested her?
They were actively collapsing under their own weight. They were a fragile coalition of convenience, united by absolutely nothing except their shared hatred of her. Once she was out of power, they immediately started fiercely fighting amongst themselves. There was massive infighting, a total lack of policy direction, and severe economic instability.
And Indira just stood there and said, hey, remember when I was in charge? Things actually work.
Exactly. Her subtext was essentially, you might not have liked my heavy-handed methods, but I kept you safe and I got things done.
And it completely worked. 1980. Just 3 short years after that most humiliating defeat imaginable, she returns to absolute power as prime minister.
It's an astounding turnaround. From a prison cell to the prime minister's office in 36 months. It speaks volumes to her incredibly deep connection with the Indian masses. Despite the trauma of the emergency, despite the arrests, a huge portion of the country still deeply saw her as Amma, the mother of the nation. They willingly forgave her transgressions because the chaotic alternative just seemed so much worse.
But just as she finally reclaims the throne, tragedy strikes again. And this time, it's not a political defeat. It's entirely visceral.
1980. The exact same year she makes her triumphant return.
Her son Sanjay dies.
A sudden plane crash right in New Delhi. He was flying a small stunt plane, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. And we have to remember, based on everything we said so far today, Sanjay wasn't just her beloved son.
No, not at all. He was her chief political architect. He was the ruthless enforcer during the emergency years. He was her closest confidant. And most importantly, he was actively being groomed to take over the dynasty.
Losing him so suddenly must have been just devastating on every level.
It broke her in a very profound way. Many historical observers say she was never quite the same after Sanjay died. She lost her main emotional and political anchor, but the political machine around her couldn't stop. The dynasty absolutely had to survive.
So she immediately turns to her other son. The source says she, quote, began preparing her other son, Rajiv, for leadership.
And Rajiv was a commercial airline pilot. He had a very quiet, happy family life. He notoriously did not want to be in the dirty world of politics, but the dynasty demanded an heir. She practically pulled him in to fill the massive void that Sanjay left behind.
It really feels like a Greek tragedy, doesn't it? The crown demands a blood sacrifice to keep the line going.
It really does. The deep personal cost of holding this much power is just immense.
And now we are rapidly moving toward the final act of her life, the assassination.
1984.
The specific context here is absolutely critical to understand why this happened. The source identifies the primary motive as the attack at the Golden Temple.
Right. Historically, this is known as Operation Blue Star.
Can you explain what that operation was briefly for the listeners?
There were heavily armed Sikh militants led by a man named Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, who had holed up inside the Golden Temple complex in Amritsar. Now, the Golden Temple is the absolute holiest shrine of the Sikh religion. They were stockpiling heavy weapons inside and demanding a completely separate independent state.
And Indira Gandhi had to make a very tough military decision.
She eventually ordered the Indian army to physically enter the Holy Temple with tanks to flush the militants out.
And the operation was successful in a strict military sense. They did clear the militants out, but the collateral damage...
It was immense and horrifying. The sacred temple complex was heavily damaged. Many, many people died, including pilgrims. The entire global Sikh community felt deeply, deeply wounded and utterly betrayed. It was widely seen as a massive sacrilege, a direct, unforgivable attack on their faith itself.
The public anger must have been palpable.
It was white hot. She was repeatedly warned by her intelligence chiefs. Her top security advisors explicitly told her to immediately remove all Sikh bodyguards from her personal security detail. They deeply feared a revenge attack from the inside.
And what did she say to that advice?
She flatly refused. She said she was the prime minister of a secular India. She argued that she couldn't possibly discriminate against her own loyal security staff based purely on their religion. She firmly thought it would send the absolute wrong message to the country.
That decision, that rigid idealism, or perhaps just stubborn denial, it literally cost her her life.
October 31st, 1984.
She is just casually walking through her garden at her residence in New Delhi, heading to an interview. And she is shot and killed.
And the perpetrators. It wasn't a foreign army hit squad. It wasn't a bitter political rival.
It was 2 of her very own bodyguards, Satwan Singh and Beant Singh. Both of them were Sikhs.
And the source notes it was precisely in retribution for the attack at the Golden Temple.
It's just the ultimate betrayal by those sworn to protect you. It's such a violent, terribly sudden end to a life that was constantly, perpetually in motion. She died at age 66.
66. It honestly seems incredibly young for someone who accomplished and experienced so much. She lived a dozen lifetimes in those 66 short years.
So we need to try to summarize this massive legacy because it is so complicated. You really can't just put her in a neat little box.
No, you can't. She completely defies simple categorization. She breaks the mold entirely.
On one hand, you have the shy, sickly student who couldn't even finish her Oxford degree, the devoted young mother who cared for her dying parent.
And on the other hand, you have the Iron Lady who boldly split Pakistan in half and created the nation of Bangladesh, the map maker.
You have the radical economic reformer who seized the banks and the massive oil companies to try and help the rural poor, who legally fought for equal pay for women.
And simultaneously, you have the strict authoritarian who suspended the entire constitution, casually jailed her political opponents, and ruled by decree. The leader who simply couldn't accept a guilty court verdict.
You have the disgraced, hated politician sitting quietly in a jail cell.
And you have the Phoenix, who miraculously rose from the political ashes to brilliantly lead the country all over again.
It's just not a black and white story. It's not a simple tale of hero or villain. It's a very complex story of raw power. How you get it, how you wield it, and ultimately how it uses you.
And I really think that brings us perfectly back to that quote the source provides at the end. It's a direct quote from Indira Gandhi herself that I think wraps this entire narrative up beautifully.
Let's hear it.
She said, quote, "Every new experience brings its own maturity and a greater clarity of vision," end quote.
Wow, that is actually really profound.
It is. She is essentially saying that even the worst hardships, the severe illness, the humiliating defeats, the terrifying arrests, the heartbreaking personal losses, they all served to sharpen her lens. They made her see the world and her specific grand role in it far more clearly.
But here's the major question I want to leave everyone listening with today. The source gives us this great quote about her clarity of vision.
Right.
But in a life marked by such extreme, dizzying highs like literally creating new nations, and so dark, extreme lows like suspending the world's largest democracy, did that clarity of vision ultimately lead to her massive success? Or was it that very clarity, that absolute unshakable certainty that she alone knew what was right for the country, that she was totally indispensable, that directly led to the emergency, the tragic Golden Temple operation, and ultimately her own violent demise?
That is the ultimate paradox of leadership, isn't it? The exact same clarity required to see what needs to be done to win a major war might be the exact same clarity, or perhaps hubris, that completely blinds you to the horrific consequences of your actions at home. Does absolute clarity sometimes just make you entirely blind?
It is definitely something to mull over. Power, vision, and the terrible cost of both.
Indeed it is.
Well, that's it for this deep dive into the Iron Lady of India, a massive figure of history who absolutely refuses to be simplified. Thanks so much for listening.
Stay curious out there.
We'll catch you on the next one. So I was walking past a souvenir shop the other day. Just, one of those generic tourist traps you see everywhere.
Right, the ones with the keychains and the magnets.
Exactly. And I saw this poster that it really stopped me in my tracks. Because it wasn't a modern celebrity. It wasn't like a superhero or anything.
Well, let me guess. A woman in a white halter dress.
Yeah, standing over a subway grate.
Laughing while the skirt billows up.
That's the one, Marilyn. And it just struck me as I was looking at it that if you showed that silhouette to almost anyone on the planet, they would recognize it instantly. I mean, she is the ultimate Hollywood icon. She's the literal definition of the sex symbol.
Oh, absolutely. I'd argue she is the most famous woman of the 20th century. She is the platinum standard for glamour. She's the archetype of the dumb blonde, and really, the face of the golden age of cinema.
And this is a massive, but for us today, there is this profound disconnect between that poster on the wall and the actual human being who lived that life.
Yeah, the gap between the myth and reality is just staggering.
Right. We see the smile, we see the red lips and the glitter, but the reality was a life defined by this crushing, repetitive cycle of abandonment and systemic abuse, plus this desperate, lifelong search for an identity that wasn't just some costume she put on.
It's the difference between the manufactured myth and the real woman. And the source material we're looking at for this deep dive today is a really comprehensive biography that strips all that veneer away.
Which is exactly what we need.
Exactly. It doesn't just look at her filmography or, box office numbers. It digs into the tragedy and the incredible complexity of Norma Jean Mortensen.
Norma Jean. That is really who we are talking about today. Because Marilyn Monroe was a construct. She was a character.
A very carefully built character.
Yeah. And our mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct that myth. For those of you listening, we aren't just here to talk about some like it hot or gentlemen prefer blondes. We really want to look at how a system created Marilyn and how Norma Jean tried to survive inside that creation.
And if you want to understand that survival mechanism, you really have to look at the themes that keep cropping up in this source material. It is not just a story about stardom. It's about a cycle of abandonment that literally starts from infancy. It's about the predation of the men she called the wolves of Hollywood. And it's this massive clash between her public persona, the dizzy blonde, and her private intellectualism, which was actually quite profound.
Plus, the medical and psychological interventions that honestly seem to have done way more harm than good in the end.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this. Let's start at the very beginning, or I guess before the beginning, because the chaos really started before she was even born.
It did. To understand Marilyn, you have to understand the completely fractured foundation she was built on. So she was born Norma Jean Mortensen on June 1st, 1926. But the identity of her father was this massive mystery that haunted her for her entire life.
Right, and it wasn't just some trivial detail.
No, it was a gaping hole in her sense of self. The source mentions that for years, it was officially unknown. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, had actually put her second husband, Martin Mortensen, on the birth certificate.
Even though she'd already left him before she was even pregnant, right?
Exactly. It was basically a legal fiction just to give the child a name so she wouldn't be illegitimate on paper. But Gladys always claimed the real father was a man named Charles Stanley Gifford.
Who was he?
He was a shift foreman at Consolidated Film Industries. That was the studio where Gladys worked as a negative cutter. So they had this brief workplace affair. But for decades, this was just a claim made by a woman who the world largely dismissed as mentally unstable.
But we have a major update here, don't we? Something that totally changes the history books.
We do, and this is a fascinating detail from the source. A DNA test in 2022 finally confirmed it.
Wow. In 2022, how'd they even do that?
They compared a lock of Monroe's hair, which had actually been preserved by her embalmer, believe it or not, with a saliva sample from Gifford's great-grandchild.
That is wild. And it proved Gladys was telling the truth the whole time.
It absolutely did. Charles Stanley Gifford was her biological father. But I want you to imagine living your whole life with that question mark. She knew who he was. She actually tried to contact him multiple times.
But he rejected her.
Completely. He wanted nothing to do with her. He was recently divorced, he had his own family, his own life, and he basically viewed Norma Jean as a mistake that he just wanted to erase.
That has to be so devastating.
Yeah.
To know your father is out there, he's alive, but he's actively choosing to reject you. And her mother, Gladys, she wasn't exactly a stabilizing force to compensate for that absence, was she?
No, she wasn't. And we need to be empathetic here because Gladys was fighting her own severe battles. Yes, she worked in the film industry, but she was deeply, deeply unstable. There was this underlying belief in their family of a curse.
A curse.
Yeah, that madness was hereditary in their bloodline. Her own parents had suffered from severe mental illness. And tragically, Gladys was eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia.
There is that one scene in the source that really stuck with me. Norma Jean is only 8 years old, and she witnesses her mother screaming, kicking, just having this violent breakdown right in front of her before the police come and take her away.
It's a foundational trauma. Think about an 8-year-old child watching the only parent she has being physically restrained and dragged out of her own house. It tells a child that the world is chaos and entirely unsafe.
And after that, Gladys was institutionalized.
Yes. And Norma was effectively an orphan with a living mother. But the thing is, even before that major breakdown, the abandonment had already started.
Right, because Gladys gave her up way before she was 8. She was just a baby.
Just 2 weeks old. At 2 weeks old, Gladys handed her over to a foster family called the Bollanders.
And this is where the cultural disconnect, this weird irony of her life really begins. Because the Bollanders were strict, they were religious, and the source describes them as pious.
Pious is putting it very lightly. They were extreme fundamentalists. They genuinely thought cinema, the very industry Gladys worked in, and the industry that would eventually consume Norma, was a diabolical temptation.
That is just the ultimate irony, isn't it? The woman who becomes the biggest movie star on the planet is raised in a house where they believed going to the movies meant you were buying a ticket to hell.
It creates this massive internal conflict for a young kid. She's living in this strict, completely joyless environment where entertainment is a sin, but then on weekends, Gladys would visit, And Gladys was a flapper. She loved to party, she idolized the movies.
So Norma is just toggling between these two completely incompatible worlds.
Exactly. She felt that dissonance constantly. She knew she didn't fit in with the Bollanders' version of reality, but she didn't really have a home with her mother either. She was an outsider everywhere she went.
And the source mentioned she really only had one friend during this time.
Tippy.
The dog.
Yeah, stray dog. And this story, honestly, it is heartbreaking, but it illustrates the cruelty of her environment perfectly. Norma Jean is around 7 years old here. This dog is her only source of consistent, non-judgmental love. It's the only living thing that is just happy to see her.
And a neighbor shot the dog.
Yeah.
Just because it barked too much.
Allegedly because it barked too much and rolled around in their garden.
That's awful.
It is. But think about the psychological lesson that teaches a 7-year-old. It teaches you that the things you love can be snatched away instantly, violently, and for completely trivial reasons. It just reinforced her isolation and this growing belief that she wasn't allowed to keep anything good in her life.
So, after Gladys is institutionalized, Norma gets passed around the system again. She ends up with Grace McKee, who was Gladys's best friend. And at first glance, reading the source, this seems like a positive turning point, right? Because Grace is the one who starts planting the seeds of stardom.
She is. Grace was the one who dressed her up, told her she was beautiful, and started taking her to the cinema. She opened that door to the magical world as Norma saw it. Grace actually used to tell her she would be the next Jean Harlow.
But Grace also represents another major betrayal.
Yes, because Grace gets married. She marries a man named Irwin Goddard. And keep in mind, this is the Great Depression era. Money is tight. They couldn't afford to keep Norma, or rather, Irwin didn't want the extra mouth to feed.
So despite Grace promising to care for her, she just sends Norma to an orphanage.
To the Los Angeles Orphans Home. Imagine that rejection. You have a mother, but she's locked up. You finally get a guardian who pays attention to you, and she chooses her new husband over you.
And while she's in the system and moving between homes, the source gets very dark regarding her safety.
We definitely have to talk about this because it explains so much of her later behavior and her absolute need for protection. The source details severe molestation. There was a boarder she called Mr. Kimmel, that was a pseudonym she used, who locked her in a room.
And then later, when she briefly went back to live with Grace and Irwin tried to rape her.
He did, and Grace's reaction to that is just...
That part made me so incredibly angry reading it. She victim blamed her own foster daughter. She literally told Norma, "You provoked him."
It is a classic, horrific response that creates immense, deep-seated shame in a victim. Norma Jean learned right then that her body was a problem. She learned that she was somehow responsible for the sexual aggression of adult men, and then there was further abuse by a cousin around 1938.
So if we pause and look at the expert analysis here from the source, think about the cumulative effect of all this. Foster homes, an orphanage, relatives who abuse you, a mother who is institutionalized, and guardians who choose their husbands over you.
It creates that exact mistrust and fear of the world that Monroe herself talked about later in her memoirs. She wrote about the lack of consistent love.
It created a void.
A lifelong, desperate, bottomless need for validation and safety. She was constantly looking for a protector, but unfortunately she learned very early on that her value to others was almost always tied to her physical self, or that she was just a burden to be discarded.
Which leads us directly into how she tried to escape that system. Because at 15 or 16, she gets married. But it wasn't some high school romance fairy tale.
No, it was a pure survival strategy. Her foster family at the time was moving to the East Coast. They couldn't take her with them because she was a ward of the state of California. So her choice was stark. Either go back to the orphanage or get married.
So she married a neighbor, James Doherty.
Right. It was a marriage of convenience.
She basically just swapped one trap for another trap. She said later she didn't dislike him, but she was bored to tears. She was stuck in this housewife role she hated, washing dishes and just waiting for her life to actually start.
But then World War II changes everything. Jim joins the Merchant Marine and ships out, and Norma Jean has to go to work.
At the radioplane ammunition factory.
Yeah.
Can you just imagine Marilyn Monroe spraying glue and laying down gutters on an assembly line?
It's a fantastic image, right? It's the total Rosie the Riveter reality. But that is exactly where David Conover finds her. He's an army photographer, and he was touring factories looking for morale-boosting photos of women war workers for Yank magazine.
And he spots this 19-year-old girl with curly brown hair.
And that was the spark. He took some photos and the camera just loved her.
Within 6 months, she's on the cover of 30 different magazines. She just lit up the page.
She had an innate relationship with the lens. Some people just have it, and she had it in spades. But she wasn't Marilyn yet. And this is where we enter the second major theme of our deep dive, the wolf's den and the literal creation of the persona.
Right, because she had to be manufactured.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the look. The source is very clear that she was not a natural blonde.
Far from it. She was a natural brunette. They tried 12 different shades of gold and blonde before they finally landed on that signature platinum pillowcase white color.
12 shades.
It was a very deliberate process of erasing Norma Jean to build something entirely new. And the name, too, was manufactured.
Yeah, Ben Lien, who was the casting head at Fox, told her, Norma Jean Mortensen is not a star's name. He said it sounded too rural, too plain.
Exactly. So she suggested Monroe, which was her grandmother's maiden name. And Ben Lien suggested Marilyn because she reminded him of a famous Broadway actress named Marilyn Miller.
So Marilyn Monroe is born in an office.
It was a construction. They were building a consumer product.
Even her voice, she lowered it. The source mentions some say it was actually to overcome a stutter she developed after the trauma with Grace's husband.
Yes, stuttering is very often a physical response to severe childhood trauma. She worked extensively with speech therapists, and they taught her that breathy, hesitant delivery. It wasn't just invented to be sexy. It was originally a coping mechanism just to get the words out fluently without getting stuck.
And the walk. I love this detail from the book. The string from the cloud technique.
This is a fascinating piece of acting history. It comes from a book she studied called The Thinking Body. She would visualize a string pulling her up from her sternum, attached to a cloud in the sky.
And that's what gave her that undulating kind of floating walk that everyone talks about.
Yes, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't just how she naturally moved. It was engineered. She studied human movement like a science.
But the engineering wasn't just physical, right? It was highly transactional. Because the source is incredibly explicit about the casting couch reality of Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s.
It paints a very grim, very realistic picture. Marilyn herself actually wrote an article titled The Wolves I Have Known. She was remarkably open about the fact that sexual bartering was just the absolute norm for young actresses.
She admitted to sleeping with producers. Her rationale was everyone did it, and if she refused, someone else would just agree and get the job instead of her.
It was a strict quid pro quo environment. The source mentions her relationship with Joseph Schenck, who was a much, much older producer. He essentially kept her, but he would also lend her out to his friends at dinner parties.
Lend her out.
Yeah. She was treated like a garnish, just arm candy for powerful men.
And there's that awful incident with Orson Welles where he witnesses her having her top ripped off at a Hollywood party while a room full of men just stood around and laughed at her. It's so humiliating.
It is deeply degrading, but here is a key analysis point from the text. Marilyn was incredibly pragmatic about all of this. She had a famous quote where she said, "I don't mind living in a man's world as long as I can be a woman in it."
Meaning she understood her leverage.
Exactly. She understood that in that specific time and place, her sexuality was literally the only currency the industry would accept from her. So she used it. She weaponized it.
She played the game because she had to. She wasn't just playing the victim all the time. She was trying to leverage whatever she had to get what she actually wanted, which was to be a respected actress.
Spot on. And that brings us perfectly to the huge conflict between the dumb blonde stereotype she played on screen and the intellectual woman she actually was in private.
This is honestly one of my favorite parts of this entire deep dive. The nude calendar scandal is the perfect example of her just flipping the script on the studio system.
It is an absolute masterclass in public relations. So let's set the scene. Back in 1949, she was completely destitute. She had lost her studio contract. She couldn't pay her rent. Her car was being repossessed. So she posed nude for a photographer named Tom Kelly for $50.
Just 50 bucks?
$50. And she signed the release form, Mona Monroe, just to try and hide her real identity.
But then jump to 1952, she starts getting famous, and these photos resurface.
Right. And the studio, of course, goes into a total panic. They tell her to deny it. They say, tell the press it's not you. Tell them it's a lookalike, whatever it takes.
But she doesn't do that. She realized that the public hates a liar way more than they hate a nude body. So she pivots. She admits it openly. She tells the press, yes, it's me. I was hungry. I needed the money to get my car back.
That is such a brilliant power move.
It totally revolutionized the public's perception of her. Instead of being scandalized and throwing her out of Hollywood, they sympathized with her.
It made her real. It made her this Cinderella story of the poor, desperate girl who did what she had to do to survive. And incidentally, it launched Playboy magazine.
Right, because Hugh Hefner bought those photos.
He bought them for $500 to put in the very first issue of Playboy.
And Monroe got absolutely nothing extra from that.
Not a single dime. Hefner built an entire global empire on her image, and she got her $50 flat fee from years prior.
Classic Hollywood exploitation. But let's talk about her mind. Because people really truly thought she was the character she played. They thought she was Lorelei Lee or the girl in the 7-Year Itch. But the source lists her personal library, and it is staggering. She owned over 400 books.
And we are not talking about light beach reading here. We are talking about Sigmund Freud, Leo Tolstoy, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Plato, Marcel Proust.
And this wasn't just for show.
No, she was reading to find herself. There's that famous photo of her sitting on a playground reading James Joyce's Ulysses.
People always assumed that was a studio prop.
They did, but it wasn't. The photographer Eve Arnold confirmed she was actually reading it. She was reading the last chapter, the Molly Bloom soliloquy, and she was reading it aloud to herself just to understand the rhythm of Joyce's words.
She also took evening classes at UCLA, right? In art and literature.
Yes. She had this intense hunger for knowledge that the studio heads completely ignored and frankly disdained. They just wanted her to smile and look pretty.
And they didn't just ignore her intellect. They vastly undervalued her financial worth. The pay disparity the source brings up is just shocking.
It really is. Take Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Jane Russell, who is obviously a big star, but arguably not the global cultural phenomenon Monroe was becoming, was paid $200,000 for that film.
And Marilyn.
Marilyn Monroe, the actual blonde in the title of the movie, was getting $500 a week.
That is just criminal.
It was the strict contract system. They felt they owned her, but Marilyn fought back. In 1954, she famously walked out on Hollywood. She packed her bags, moved to New York City, and formed her own production company.
Marilyn Monroe Productions, which was completely unheard of for a woman, let alone a sex symbol, to do at that time.
It was a massive, unprecedented power move. She was effectively going on strike against 20th Century Fox to demand creative control and better pay. She wanted to pick her directors, pick her scripts. She wanted to be taken seriously. She famously said, "I am not a piece of meat."
She demanded respect. And I think that profound desire for respect and for real love bled heavily into her relationships with men. The Force makes a really interesting recurring point that she was looking for a father figure in every lover she had.
It is a constant theme throughout her life. Remember, she kept a picture of Clark Gable under her pillow as a child and literally pretended he was her father. She was always looking for that protection she never got from Charles Stanley Gifford.
She gravitated toward men who could be mentors or protectors or guides. So let's talk about the big relationships, starting with Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper.
The traditionalist. That is exactly how we should view him in the context of her life. He was a conservative, old-school Italian-American. He was deeply jealous. He was controlling. And what he really wanted was a housewife.
He wanted Norma Jean to stay home and make spaghetti, not Marilyn Monroe, to be 50 feet tall on billboards.
Exactly. And that underlying tension finally exploded with the famous subway great scene in the 7-Year Itch.
The breaking point.
You really have to picture the scene as the source describes it. It is not on a closed, quiet soundstage in Burbank. They are filming on location on Lexington Avenue in New York City at 2 in the morning.
And there's a massive crowd.
There are roughly 2,000 men. Fans and press just crowding the street, pushing against the barricades.
And every single time the director yells action and that skirt blows up,
the crowd just goes wild. They're cheering, whistling, screaming her name. And Joe DiMaggio is standing right there in the front row, having to watch his wife be publicly ogled by 2,000 screaming men.
And he loses his mind.
According to the director, Billy Wilder, DiMaggio's face went white with death. He stormed off. And later that night, back at the St. Regis Hotel, the source notes there was a very violent physical fight.
The book mentioned she had bruises on her shoulders the next day on set.
Yes, bruises that the makeup department had to cover with heavy body makeup just so they could keep shooting.
And she filed for divorce very shortly after that, citing mental cruelty.
Right. So she leaves the traditionalist, and eventually she goes to the intellectual, Arthur Miller, the great American playwright.
The press called it Egghead Weds Hourglass.
Which is such a condescending headline for both of them, but she loved him because she truly thought he saw her soul. She thought, finally, here's a man who respects my mind, who sees past the blonde hair.
She completely integrated into his world. She even converted to Judaism for him. She started hanging out with the New York literati.
But then comes the betrayal. And honestly, this one hurts to read about.
She finds his diary.
Or a notebook that he left lying open on a table. She reads an entry where Miller is just venting about his marriage. And he basically writes that he is deeply disappointed in her.
Oh, man.
He calls her a child. He says he is embarrassed and ashamed of her in front of his intellectual friends. He wrote that he thought he was marrying an angel, but he realized he married a whore.
Imagine finding that.
Yeah.
Just imagine. The one person you finally think sees you for you, the person you revere as a genius, and he's actually secretly ashamed of you.
It utterly devastated her fragile self-esteem. It confirmed her absolute worst, deepest fear, that she was inherently unlovable and not good enough.
And it was during this marriage that she suffered an ectopic pregnancy and later miscarriage.
Rice. She was desperately blaming herself for the loss of those pregnancies. She was abusing sleeping pills heavily just to cope with the depression, and she felt like she had completely failed at being a woman in the one way she truly wanted to be, by becoming a mother.
She also had a brief affair with Yves Montand around this time during the filming of Let's Make Love, but that fizzled out pretty quickly.
It did. It was a brief distraction from her crumbling marriage.
And then, of course, we have to talk about the Kennedy rumors. The source touches on this, specifically the famous Happy Birthday, Mr. President incident at Madison Square Garden.
The dress that was so tight, she literally had to be sewn into it backstage. The performance itself was incredibly intimate, much too intimate for a public political gala.
The source outlines the speculation about her having affairs with both John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy.
It does, and we want to be clear that we are just reporting what the source material presents here without taking a definitive side on the historical truth of those rumors.
Right. But the source points out the tragic echo in that situation, if it were true. The idea that she might have been passed between powerful political brothers, much in the same way she was passed between powerful studio producers in her early days.
It perfectly fits the lifelong pattern the book identifies. High-status men using her for her glamorous image, enjoying the thrill of conquering Marilyn Monroe, but never ever offering the actual security and protection that Norma Jean craved. She was always a trophy to them, never a true partner.
So, while her personal life is completely crumbling, she's still fighting tooth and nail to be a serious, respected actress. She goes to the Actors Studio in New York. She starts working closely with Lee Strasberg. This brings us to the method and the madness section of our deep dive.
Strasberg is a highly controversial figure in her life story. She went to him specifically to kill the pinup image once and for all, and Strasberg preached the method.
Which is heavily reliant on emotional recall, right?
Exactly. You use your own real-life traumatic memories to fuel the character's emotions on stage or on camera. But for Marilyn, look at the memories she had to pull from. Abandonment, sexual abuse, the orphanage, loneliness.
And Strasberg is forcing her to dig that up constantly, every single day.
It's like picking a scab that never has a chance to heal. The source describes him as a despotic mentor.
It sounds incredibly dangerous for someone so fragile.
It was. Now, to be fair, it did make her a dramatically better actress. If you look at her performance in Bus Stop, she is incredible. She is raw, she's vulnerable, her accent is perfect, but the psychological cost was immense. She couldn't separate the intense emotions of the role from her reality.
And she became completely dependent on Strasberg and his wife, Paula.
Entirely. They effectively just replaced her old studio handlers with themselves. They went everywhere with her.
And then the psychiatrist came into the picture, specifically Dr. Ralph Greenson.
Yet another father figure. And Greenson's methods were highly unusual, to put it mildly. He integrated himself into her life completely. He practiced something he called adoption therapy.
Adoption therapy, meaning he tried to actually become her family.
Yes. He tried to reparent her.
The source says he literally had her sleeping at his house.
He had her staying with his family, eating dinner with his kids. He tried to dictate her entire schedule. He vetted her friends. He isolated her from anyone he deemed a bad influence.
He thought he was saving her, but he was just creating this massive, suffocating dependency.
Exactly. He became the center of her universe.
And then there's the story of her institutionalization at the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York. Reading this in the source was like reading a horror movie script.
It really was. She went in thinking she was just going to a nice private room for exhaustion and rest, but her doctors had actually committed her to the severe psychiatric ward.
They locked her in a padded cell.
Locked doors, barred windows, padded walls. It was her absolute worst nightmare coming true. She believed she was finally succumbing to the family curse and becoming her mother, Gladys.
But the way she escapes it is the most brilliant, most Marilyn thing possible.
She used her acting skills. She sat in that cell and realized, well, if they're going to treat me like a violent nut, I will give them exactly what they want.
She basically recreated a scene from her own movie, Don't Bother to Knock. She took a chair, smashed a light bulb, grabbed a piece of the jagged glass, and threatened to end her life if they didn't let her out.
It got their attention, that's for sure, but the medical staff still wouldn't release her.
So who finally comes to get her out? It's not Arthur Miller, it's not her intellectual friends, and it's certainly not the acting coaches who claim to care about her soul.
No. It was Joe DiMaggio.
The traditionalist.
He flew straight to New York, walked into Payne Whitney, and threatened to tear the building down brick by brick with his bare hands if they didn't release her to him immediately.
It is such a complex, messy relationship. But when it came down to life and death, he was the only one who actually showed up.
He was the only man in her life who didn't want anything from her anymore, other than her safety.
Which brings us, tragically, to the final act of her life, the filming of The Misfits.
This film is tough to talk about. It was supposed to be Arthur Miller's grand valentine to her. He wrote the screenplay specifically for her to prove she was a dramatic heavyweight.
But the character he wrote, Rosalind, was basically a cruel, thinly veiled caricature of Marilyn's own real-life struggles.
She felt completely mocked by the script. She said to her friends, "He is putting my private pain on a screen for everyone to point at and see."
And the set itself was a notorious disaster. They were out in the scorching Nevada desert. She was heavily medicated, she was constantly late, and she was absolutely terrified of acting opposite her co-star.
Because her co-star was Clark Gable, the man whose picture she had kept under her pillow, her fictional father, her childhood idol.
She was completely paralyzed by the fear of disappointing him.
And sadly, Clark Gable died of a massive heart attack very shortly after filming wrapped.
And because the shoot had been so stressful, and Marilyn had been so difficult with her delays and endless retakes, there were horrible rumors going around that she had caused his stress-induced heart attack.
Gable's widow even insinuated it to the press. And Marilyn, who already carried so much guilt, felt completely responsible. She spiraled deeply after that.
So we spiral toward the very end. She gets fired from her next movie, Something's Gotta Give, because she's sick and absent too often. She is isolated in her new house. And then, August 5th, 1962.
She is found dead at age 36 in her bedroom in Brentwood.
The official cause was acute barbiturate poisoning, a lethal mix of Nembutal and chloral hydrate. The source notes there were 12 to 15 empty pill bottles on her nightstand.
The source outlines the various theories surrounding her death, everything from suicide to a tragic accidental overdose to the persistent murder theories connected to the Kennedys and a little red diary she supposedly kept.
And again, we want to impartially present what the book covers without endorsing any specific conspiracy. The source itself acknowledges all those theories, but tends to lean toward the tragedy of an accidental overdose, or perhaps a suicide driven by a sudden intense moment of despair.
Ultimately, the source suggests the why almost matters less than the profound loss itself. The reality is she was gone.
And the funeral. Once again, it was Joe DiMaggio who stepped in.
He took complete charge, and he barred the entire Hollywood elite from attending. He barred Arthur Miller, he barred the studio executives, the producers, the wolves. He famously told them, if it wasn't for you people, she would still be here.
He explicitly blamed the industry for eating her alive.
And he proved his devotion. For 20 years after she died, he had fresh red roses delivered to her crypt 3 times a week.
3 times a week for 2 decades. That is just incredibly heavy.
It is. It's the ultimate tragedy of a woman who was entirely consumed by the very industry she conquered.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, when we look at all this source material, what is the ultimate takeaway?
The main takeaway is that Marilyn Monroe's life was a massive collision of immense, undeniable talent and immense unhealed trauma. She succeeded despite the studio system, not because of it. And the source makes this poignant note that because she died so young, she remains completely frozen in time.
She never ages in our minds.
Exactly. She is always the flowering woman, forever 36, forever beautiful.
But at what cost? That is the real question.
The source ends with a very provocative thought. It says, Marilyn is everywhere. In the end, Monroe received the love of millions, but did it satisfy her?
It leaves you wondering about the true price of fame. She was seen by absolutely everyone, but it really feels like she was known by almost no one. Which leads me to a final thought that wasn't explicitly in the book, but feels so relevant after discussing all of this.
What's that?
Did we, the public, consume her just as much as the studio executives did? We bought the tickets, we bought the magazines, we bought into the myth, we demanded the dumb blonde, and we ignored the woman reading Joyce on the playground. It makes you wonder if our endless appetite for icons is just another type of wolf.
That is a very unsettling but very true perspective. A woman hiding in plain sight behind a smile that everyone felt entitled to own.
Well, that is certainly a lot to process. It completely changes the way I will look at those souvenir posters from now on.
As well it should.
That's it for this deep dive into the life of Marilyn Monroe. She was a tragic, brilliant, and endlessly fascinating human being behind the icon.
She truly was.
Thanks for listening. We will catch you on the next deep dive.